Welcome to the MUFG Global Markets Podcast. I'm John Cook, and I'm joined today by George Goncalves, MUFG's head of U.S. macro strategy. It's Tuesday, July 2nd, 2025. Welcome back to the podcast, George.
Great to be on, John. Good week to be on.
Yeah, I can't believe it's July. That's seems we're more than halfway through the year. Nuts. And it's yeah, it's a short week, short and sweet week with a ton going on. I mean, we've already had, we had month end on Monday. We've got a bunch of, we've got some trade deals coming out of DC. We've got the one big beautiful bill progressing, ton of economic data. I mean, just and we have the non-farm payroll report on Thursday, which I think we're gonna talk a little bit about. Let's see. To get a question to you, I think the setup into payrolls is interesting, and this is something we've talked about on the desk. We've had continued weaker related employment data. Very notably, ADP, and I'm not a fan of that number, but ADP, which was released on Wednesday, which is the day we're recording this podcast, showed a negative print. That's the first negative print since 2022. And you reminded me of this, but that was during a week, sort of a string of weak GDP prints in the course of that year. So I guess the question is for you, like, how are you thinking about the data? How does that like tie with your macro view, go against your macro view? Talk our listeners through that.
Yeah, let's maybe kind of set the stage and think about it. And I generally agree with you that ADP has proven to be a kind of a false indicator, but kind of working our way backwards. Yeah, as you mentioned, super action-packed week, a lot of information, on the macro front, largely linked back to an update on the jobs data. In the jobs environment. ADP, a negative number is never a good number. I think you just have to say that straight out. Number two, a lot of it was in the smaller businesses of less than 50 employees, which have gone negative, and that clearly is showing weakness in the private sector. And there was a lot of high hopes. If you look at like the NFIB surveys, there was a huge kind of bump, the Trump bump, kind of animal spirits in Q4 into early Q1, a lot of expectations from small businesses. And yet, the tariff shock / kind of volatility that we've seen, and just really like, not really a clear direction on some of these things. And a lot of it is being held up, this uncertainty, which could pass, once we get the one big beautiful bill finally signed. But nonetheless, there's been a lot of kind of cross currents, which have at least kind of reduced that sort of animal spirits, number one, but beyond just the feelings and the sentiment, which a lot of policymakers, including, Chair Powell, has been very dismissive of, that the sentiment doesn't necessarily have to translate into the hard data. But guess what? The hard data also has been getting weaker too. And so I do think that, like, if you look at back orders, if you look at just like general activity has definitely decelerated. And even though Q2 is going to look better than Q1 was abysmal. I mean, like Q1, started off with at least it looked like the consumer was spending, and now the consumer basically has had the weakest sort of spending pattern since 2011. Real retail sales is basically flat this year. There's been no spending from the consumer side. Personal income has been very low, and that all kind of hints at real deceleration in the labor market, because if you don't have income, or you have less spending power or disposable income. So there's a lot there, a lot that kind of paints the picture that we are due for the upcoming job prints to start to really reflect this. The jobs data, I've been very critical of that data. It's been overstated by the birth death model and all these sort of seasonal adjustments over the years. But at some point, it has to show up in the jobs data. We think it's going to start showing up in the coming months, and maybe starting this week.
That's a good segue here. And just to kind of be complete, like I very much agree with you that the data kind of under the hood doesn't look so good. I do think those should acknowledge the stronger than expected JOLTS data. So maybe just quickly talk us through that, because I think you saw some underlying weakness in that print as well.
Yeah, I mean, like the JOLTS data. I mean, we usually typically look at the headline, and that's largely because Fed policymakers have really drawn our attention to the headline, how many job openings there are. But it's really the composition that matters, and also underneath, how many people are quitting versus how many hirings are really taking place. And we got a mixed signal there in this in this last reading, which was as of May, not for June, by the way. It's always 1 month behind.
Right.
And so like I don't know, and a lot of it was kind of focused in the travel and leisure, hospitality, restaurant, which could be having impacts from what's happening on the immigration front.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of like noise potentially in that data, and in general, it's one of the worst responded surveys that's from a data collection. Like so, it could be garbage in, garbage out, and a lot of seasonal adjustments. So I don't want to completely dismiss it because it was a big jump of almost 500,000, I think, and it was way beyond what consensus was expecting, and that did put the rates market in a more defensive mode after a big rally. But maybe that was just kind of a healthy cleaning of what's going on out there, a healthy kind of purge.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for that. And let's segue back into the main event here. We've got the June employment report coming out on Thursday, which is when most of our listeners will be listening to this episode, as opposed to the typical Friday because it is the July 4th holiday here in the States. What should our listeners watch out for? What are the scenarios? How the market might react? That sort of stuff.
Yeah. Let's set the baseline really quick. Baseline is for a weaker number versus last month, 139,000 in May. Bloomberg consensus is around 110. The unemployment rate, which I think we've covered over the course of the last couple of weeks, I think is also understated. I mean, if it wasn't for the big drop off in the household survey of, you would have gotten a 4.5, 4.6 unemployment rate, and it was 4.24 last month, very close to being 4.3. So right now the expectation is for a 4.3 for the June number. If you get anything above 4.3, I think that's going to be noteworthy. So those are the baselines. I think, look, the mood is definitely concern around, will this be a negative print? I mean, I'm not sure if we get enough to create a negative print, just like we saw with the ADP, but that would really be, I think, a watershed moment that would really kind of inflect the market, but critically the Fed to start to really think we have a bigger problem at hand, even though every single month we get revisions in out of roughly 35 to 50,000 per month, which tells you that NFP has been overstated as well. So it's going to be a tricky one. I think if it's anything above 4.4 on the unemployment rate, that's going to matter more than the actual headline. So even if the headline were to come in better than 110, I think the market won't completely react to that unless it's closer to 200,000 or more. Then the market would say that's a really strong number. But if it's like somewhere around 100, 4.3, I think we're probably priced in for that and maybe beyond that. We're probably priced in for a sub 100,000, probably upside risks to unemployment rate. If we were to get a negative number, I do think on the headline, I do think that really shifts the odds on the Fed in a meaningful way, maybe getting us closer to 50-50 on a July cut.
And remind me, what's the Fed's expectation for the unemployment rate for this year?
Yeah, so the Fed in its most recent June SEP forecast updates, they shifted it up to 4.5 from 4.4. So they're giving themselves a little bit of headroom. Mm-hmm. But if we get to 4.4, 4.5, we're basically there at the middle of the year, way ahead of schedule of what they were anticipating, and it doesn't stop there. It typically, once it starts trending, it keeps going higher. I mean, like most likely we're going to get to 5% on the unemployment rate at the end of this year, early part of next year, unless we have a real seismic shift on the way that companies are thinking about hiring. And if you look at all the layoff announcements and things that we're hearing, it's just going to be hard to see how companies at the middle of the year are going to start to really hire in mass, while at the same time the government is still, doing job reductions, and a lot of the sort of job reductions that happen are going to come out of their severances in September, August, September. It's really hard to see how this is going to really turn around in a way that would lower the unemployment rate from here. So there's more upside risk, and it's going to hit before the Fed's target.
For sure. I've definitely heard you say in client meetings that the unemployment rate is the most non-linear data set out there. And this, so I can certainly see it starting to go and then going. Just as an aside, I note that the whisper number is 98,000 versus the, currently 98,000. Obviously that'll move, but versus the consensus of 110,000 that you mentioned. So to your point, the market appears to be priced for something a little bit on the soft side. But let's, so thank you for that very comprehensive preview of the June employment report. But I also think we would be remiss without kind of like touching on the more macro view. You put out a great piece. It was in your latest macro to markets outlook called "A Stitch in Time Saves Nine," which maybe some of our older listeners would might be familiar with that phrase. So the subtitle was kind of interesting. It says uncertainty may be fading, but the consumer is tapped out. Can the Fed cut in time? I suspect that that's sort of the punchline of the piece. But why don't you go over the high points for the benefit of our listeners?
Yeah, and that piece actually in our view in general really hinges on this NFP. And I usually don't like to kind of hook or latch on to just one data point as being super critical, but we are very out of consensus. I think we're the only house, maybe someone else out there that I'm not aware of, but that still is holding on to the July cut. And it's in the spirit of that subtitle, which is, although we're seeing a lot of wins on the administration side. Well, at some point we're going to get this hopefully this bill passed, the big beautiful bill. There's been peace negotiations after some pretty intense conflicts down in the Middle East. There's things going on the trade front. I mean, hopefully a number of trade deals are going to get released over the coming weeks. So those are all good outcomes, good wins, and that lifts some of the uncertainty that's been kind of hanging over the markets and the economy. But at the same time, it's run up against a consumer that's largely gotten tapped out. You're seeing it in delinquencies on credit cards, autos. Now you're starting to see a small uptick in mortgages, but just in general, there's less disposable income out there amongst the consumers, and they're still worried about potential higher prices that may come through if tariffs do come into effect regardless. And so you have a very defensive consumer worried about their jobs, job market getting softer. It's like at this weird inflection point that this is when the Fed's supposed to put in insurance cuts to avoid a downturn, to at least try to catch it and not wait for it. Because if they wait, then they're going to have to cut even more. So that's been my view in a nutshell. And so I think that can they cut in time? I think if the jobs data is soft enough and we get a weak enough inflation print again this month, and the Fed starts pivoting, I know the clock is running out and has to perfectly line up for a July cut, but I don't think it's impossible. So I'm going to stick with it until we see what NFP brings us. But if we're a little bit too ahead of ourselves, I think all this would mean that if they were not to cut in July, that it just increases the odds of September just basically being a shoe-in. Nothing ever is guaranteed in life, but I would think that September, almost like a deja vu of last year, you're going to get a repeat of the Fed cutting in September. Then where the main question then really becomes, is it 25 or 50? Because they made the same mistake, I think, last year. They should have cut 25 last July. They didn't. They waited. They did 50. And if the jobs data keeps getting progressively worse over the summer, as we think it will, this is just the start of it if we get it tomorrow, then they're going to look up in September and say, yep, we're behind the curve again, and they're going to have to do 50. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Well said. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I've heard people say. So yeah, that was great, George. In case anyone's interested in a little bit more, though, I would definitely encourage our listeners to check out George's latest macro to markets outlook, entitled again "A Stitch in Time Saves Nine." He's also going to put out an employment report preview that should be on your emails or on the website. By the time you're listening to this episode, and if you are still not receiving George and his team's strategy reports, do check out the MUFG Research portal at www.mufgresearch.com, where you can find all of your favorite MUFG research, as well as sign up to have it conveniently delivered to your inbox. Great stuff as always. Thanks, George.
Thank you, John.
And thank you for listening to the Global Markets Podcast. Rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And reach out to your MUFG sales rep for any further information. Check back soon for more insights from the Global Markets Research Team.